for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Joseph Soa. I'm the founder of the Wizarding School for Composers. I'm a composer and a theorist and a teacher, and I put on these workshops to help composers like you write better music and enjoy the process of writing music more. Today, we're going to be looking at the Adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony. Many of you have had the opportunity to many of you have know this piece. Many of you have had the opportunity to study this piece before. And before we get into it, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of how this is going to work, give us a chance to get to know each other a little bit, and go from there. So first off, we're just gonna do some little bit of introductions. I'm gonna get to know you a little bit. Again, I know some of you I don't know. And then over the course of this workshop, I outlined 5 different things, 5 different aspects of string writing in the Adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony that I think are particularly interesting, things that I think will help you all with your string writing. Because there are so many of us in this room, if you have a question, please raise a Zoom hand. And if you do that, I will see you and I can answer your question and I'll get to you. In general, we'll have a whole time at the end for question and answers. So anyway, that's kind of what it is that we're thinking. So we're going to start off with just some like introductory stuff. Then we're going to go through, 5 different aspects of Mahler's string writing I find are interesting. We're going to wrap this up with a Q&A, and we're going to do this all in about an hour. So that's the plan for today. So just to kick things off and just so we can get to know each other a little bit, go over in the chat and just really basic question. You ready for this? Do you play a stringed instrument? And if so, what instrument do you play? So just go ahead in the chat, throw it in there. Okay. So I see a guitarist, a cellist, a violist, lots of no's. Oh, Joseph, it's good to see you here. Joseph plays violin and viola. Jessica says yes-ish on the viola. I love that. Electric bass and guitar. Okay, cool. Henrik, so for me, and I saw someone else who had the guitar as well, I feel like guitar and bass are sort of like cousins to the kind of string writing for orchestral string writing, because, I'm a violinist, and as a violinist, I feel like I understand things about fingering and things about plucking that like this kind of translates over into playing guitar. So I'm like kind of comfortable on guitar, but kind of uncomfortable. Henrik and the rest of you who play guitar, I'm curious if you have a similar experience. If you've ever like picked up a violin or a cello and have tried it out and are like, oh yeah, this sort of feels guitar-like, but it has its own sort of confusing tendencies. Okay, cool. So we've talked a little bit about like, so the sense that I'm getting is it's sort of like 50-50 of you in the room. How about half of you have played string instruments, the other half of you haven't. It's kind of the sense. I'm going to ask a similar sort of question. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I am terrified, to 10, I can do this in my sleep, how comfortable do you feel about writing for strings? So again, 1 is this is the last thing I want to do, and 10 is, yeah, let's go for it. Okay. So lots of 6s and 7s. We have a 1. Chunming, I thank you for being honest. I mean, going down there, holding on the fort. Okay. Looks like the average is sort of sitting between 6 and 8 or so, although we have a few 4s that are coming in too. Okay. So I could keep on asking questions, and if we had time in this workshop, I would love to get to know all of you and find out more about your string writing stuff. But for the sake of time, thanks for giving me a sense for where you all are. I want to ask one final question before we dive into Mahler stuff, and this is sort of like a bridge question. And it's sort of like a 2-part question. Part number 1 is, did you listen to the piece and follow along with the score sometime in the last week or so? That's part 1. And part 2 is, what did you like about the Adagietto? So Have you listened to it within the last 7 days? And what do you like about this piece? Okay. Brandon likes the passing dissonances, the emotional intensity. Christina, love this answer. What's there not to like? Amen. The flow, the layers of the string writing, the economy of the technique and the structure. Okay, great. So I actually want to call on one of you. So just if someone was willing to raise a Zoom hand again, I'll call on you and let's have a conversation about what it is that you put in the chat. Whoever wants to. Yeah, Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, it's taking it on its own, of course, it's a wonderful example of string writing. It is lean at times, it is wonderfully full at times. He incorporates harp quite effectively in percussive ways and also very lyrical ways. And it stands formally on its own as almost like a tone poem, but also in wonderfully stark contrast to the rest of the symphony, which of course does become so dense in so many places and is such a huge um, scale, and a huge scale. I also just want to take a quick aside in that I feel like it's misunderstood in a similar way to the second movement of Beethoven's Seven, where the Adagietto is often seen as this hugely almost tragic, overly romantic expression when in fact it is a very intimate love letter.
Hmm.
Just the way that the second movement of Beethoven Seven is often seen as a funeral march when it's really a pavane. Um, so I think the way that he scaled everything down and made such incredible use of these virtuosic instruments in a more musically than technically virtuosic way is just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, no, I can totally see that. And I thanks for sharing that, Joseph, because I feel like you sort of like captured as I've been skimming through the comments there, like this is the direction that the comments are in over there. But as I've been skimming through the comments, like this is, I think you've captured what a lot of people have been resonating with this piece. So this is what I want to do. So thank you all for sharing your thoughts on this. And again, as we go forward, if you have a question, feel free to raise a Zoom hand. If you want to put it in the chat, I'll be following along with that too. And I want to, before we get into what it is we're doing, I want to talk about a little bit about what we're not going to be talking about today. We're not going to be talking about all that much about harmony and voice leading. There's some really interesting stuff going on with the harmony and voice leading in this piece. We're going to talk about it like maybe a little bit, but today we're talking mostly about orchestration and the way that the textures work. Another thing that we're not going to be really talking about is motivic development today. I mean, so both of these things, the harmony, the motivic development, if you're going to really take the time to analyze this piece, it's worth looking into. But today, we're just going to skim over that. And you may have seen this. I'm going to share my screen here. Here, 1 second. Need to swap something. Okay, cool. So this is my formal diagram that I made of the piece. I'm sharing this with you again, just as let me just sort of like very, in a very condensed way, just show roughly what's happening in this piece. Again, we don't have time to get into these details, but just so that we have an idea of what's going on in the piece. This is roughly how I've outlined the piece. And I'm taking that and I'm just dropping it in the chat. Now you can all have that there. For me personally, I hear this piece in 3 big sections. I hear it as a kind of a ternary form. You have the opening section that goes from roughly from bar 1 to 38. That's in the key of F. There's a transposed cadence there to A minor, but then it quickly goes back to F. The middle section does all of this really fun modulatory kind of stuff. We very quickly go from F to C minor, and then from C minor to B flat. This is actually a deceptive cadence, and he uses this deceptive cadence to take us to G flat. And then we go from G flat to E to D, and then back to F. And so I'm just going to comment on a couple of things before we move on from this. The way that Mahler takes us from key to key, I think, is kind of interesting. Again, the first big modulation in this middle section, he affects that using a deceptive cadence. These other three modulations, he makes them all happen using augmented sixth chords. This one right here is some sort of enharmonic German sixth. This one has the same sonority as a French sixth. He's not using it exactly as a French sixth, but it's the same pitch class set as a French sixth. But that's how it is. That's how it is that we're getting from. This is how it is that we're getting from C minor to G flat to E to D to F. The last thing that I just point out about this before we really move on from here, obviously this is a tritone relationship. And then in terms of what this is doing is we're just walking down by step, is that we're in, G flat is the same thing as F sharp, right? And so F sharp to E to D, and then we have this chromatic mediant, and then that brings us back to F. So this is my very fast overview of what's happening in the piece harmonically and formally. And, if those of you who have taken the time to analyze it, I'm not making any sort of claims that this is the definitive analysis of this movement, but I will just pause right here and just say, before we move on and we start talking about orchestrational details, does anyone have any questions about this? Does this make sense? Okay. Because there are so many people here, I'm going to do that annoying teacher thing where I just sit in silence for a bit, just to confirm that everyone's good. Okay. So again, you have that chart. I might refer back to this. As we go, but I just wanted to orient us in the movement about what the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at with the orchestration. So, all right. So now we're into the meat of things. So 5 things that we can learn from Mahler about his orchestration. The very first thing has to do with the use of texture. Now, I want to define the word texture for you because there are 2 common ways that when composers talk about texture, they tend to talk about 2 different things. So one way that composers talk about texture is kind of a metaphorical way of talking about texture, of saying that this passage has a lot of really intricate stuff going on, and so it feels like it has a really intricate texture, sort of metaphorically speaking, because all of the parts create, a metaphorical texture to it. So that's metaphorical texture. Sometimes when composers talk about texture, that's what they're talking about. When I'm talking about texture, I'm actually talking about it in the more strict definition of how is it that the parts relate to each other. And so if we're talking about how do the parts relate to each other, you all have probably heard these words: homophony, polyphony, monophony. Those are the 3 textures that everyone tends to know. Those are one of the best sources that I know for that is actually coming from Aaron Copland's book, What to Listen For in Music. If you're in my Wizarding School for Composers course, you know that I think that that's an oversimplification of textures. I think that there's actually about 10 basic texture types that we could talk about. We will get into what texture type predominates this movement in a second, but I want to talk about one thing just before that in terms of Mahler's use of texture and how to write for strings. And if you're taking notes, this is the thing to take notes on. the biggest thing that I see that composers, particularly composers who are scared of writing for strings, is that they look at the string orchestra and they think, oh, this is just an SATBB choir. You know, it's just soprano, alto, bass, soprano, alto, bass, baritone, bass. Or, I'm stumbling over that, but you know what I'm trying to say, right? SAT bar B. That's what they think that, oh, violin 1 is the sopranos, violin 2 is the altos, viola is the tenor, and so on, right? How many of you have thought something like this about the strings in the past? Okay,
That's exactly how I treated the strings in my orchestra piece, for which I am mostly more festival right now, Fantasia and Fugue in B flat major.
yeah.
That
Yeah,
got
this
that
is a
got read a couple of days ago.
oh, thanks. Thanks, Greta. Yeah, so
Um,
this is a common way of thinking about the strings. And what I want to do is, and can you treat the strings this way? Yes. But what I want to do is I want to challenge this notion and just say, and I'm going to show you how Mahler challenges it as well. And just say that if you're thinking about strings like it's a 5-part choir, you're thinking about them wrong. So this, maybe a little bit of hard stuff, right? And here's why, is that if you're thinking about string as a 5-part choir, the temptation is to use a bunch of open voicings. Everyone here know what I say when I say open voicings? So open voicings, just for those of you who might not be aware, open voicings are where, if you have a chord, let's say a C chord, right? An open voicing is one where a closed voicing is one where you're fitting all of the chords in the tone. So we go from, for instance, C4 to E4 to G4 to C5. We're hitting all of the notes in the chord and we're not leaving any gaps. An open voicing is one where you have gaps between the chord tones. Another way of thinking about open voicing, another common way that open voicing is called is it's often called choral voicing. Choral voicing tends to have this open spacing in it as well. And this is the issue that we have in strings. And I've been blabbing on about a lot of stuff. So let me pull up the score and just start to show you things in this piece. Now, obviously, you're going to find examples throughout this piece of open voicing. But right from the start, one of the things that makes Mahler's string writing, very characteristic string writing, and what makes it strong string writing is that he's not writing for this like it's a choir. In other words, he's not voicing it like that. So if you look at what's happening here in these different parts, you have this is obviously an appoggiatura, but you have, let's back up a bit. So you have this to the F, that's the closed, this is that same note. This F is filling in the gap there, so that is also closed. This is just the A that's beneath that. And so if you look at all of these things, you'll see that this is existing in this closed voicing space. Now, one thing that is important to note about closed voicing is that closed voicing applies to the upper voices. It doesn't apply to the bass. Is that when you're talking about like the upper 3 or 4 parts, those are the ones that are not going to have any gaps between the chord tones. You can have as wide of a gap as you want between the upper voices and the bass voice. And that's exactly what it is that we see here, is that we have in bar 3 a 6th between the second viola and the cello. And then you also have the double basses that are sometimes, so this is of course a 5th apart. Now these are an octave apart going on here. But anyway, what you'll see is that what you're going to find is that if you look through all of the score, you'll discover that there's a lot of closed voicings, and it's this closed voicing that's it's making a string orchestra sound like a string orchestra rather than sounding like, well, frankly, a harmony assignment. So that's thing number 1, having to do with texture. Thing number 2, having to do with texture, that I wanted to point out for you. Is, again, what I'm saying is that a string orchestra is not a 5-part choir. And Mahler shows that very succinctly. So This is a moment where I'm just going to say unmute yourself and shout out. How many parts do you see in this staff right here? Just literally just counting this. How many parts?
Six.
Six. There are 6 parts there. Great. How many parts here?
Six.
Yeah, there are
6.
6. Yep, great. Yeah, thanks for those who are willing to just shout stuff out. How many parts in this top system over here?
6.
6.
6.
Right?
Yep.
7.
All right.
7.
Yeah, actually, yeah, there are a little bit more because you have those violas there, right? And so likewise, in this system, it's sort of a trick question. How many parts are in this system right here, of a middle system?
6.
Yeah, there are more. We could go through and we could do this entire exercise for this. What you'll discover is that in the string writing here in the Adagietto, 13 out of the 14 systems, in other words, just to clarify terms, right? Lines of music, this is a system. 13 out of 14 systems in this piece have some kind of divisi in them. This is so common for string writing. Like Stravisi, if you're not using divisi in your string writing, you're not writing idiomatic string music. And this Adagietto is just a prime example of this, is that Mahler is dividing and redividing his strings all over the place in this movement. And so it's a really basic thing that I'm pointing out. But again, if we're trying to learn from Mahler about how to write idiomatically for strings and how to write with passion, interest, well, you're going to have to use divisi. That's just the nature of writing for strings. So basic things. Yeah. Strings are not an SAT bar B choir, and we use divisi. Okay, John, I see you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about the usage of divisi. I think for me, and I don't know if this is echoed in other people's experience, but for me, I always get a little bit nervous to overcrowd the texture, and so that I end up with something incredibly sparse that doesn't really sound like music, but I do that almost as a kind of kind of a accidental coping mechanism, because I don't want to overcrowd it, and so I end up not using divisi. Do you have any kind of suggestions of how to introduce it?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to introduce it. I'm going to answer your question, and thanks for your question. Let me know if I answer this, but I'm going to introduce it by saying this other thing about texture because I think it relates directly. Again, one of the challenges that when we write for really any ensemble, but strings, I think, is the temptation is here, is to write for the string orchestra like we're writing a harmony exercise, where I'm going to write out each individual part. I'm just going to do it one part at a time, and I'm going to think of each part as its own individual part rather than thinking about how it is that the parts are coordinating with each other. Now, if you look at what Mahler is doing in this symphony, Mahler is not writing this. This does not look like a Bach chorale. Just, for reference, I know that you all, you know the Bach chorales, and for those of you who don't, you probably secretly do. But just for reference, I'm just going to pull these up side by side. This is what Bach chorales look like. And you'll see that, all of the parts are moving at roughly the same rate. They're all moving at like this quarter note, eighth note, half note kind of thing, right? Whereas if you look at the Mahler, what you'll see is that you have a melody that is clearly moving faster than everything else, and you have some sustained lines. Obviously, this is page 1, but even if you're to go to some of the other pages, you'll see that this is pretty similar. Here in the middle of this system, similar sort of stuff. The melody is the thing that has the moving eighth notes. The accompaniment is, sitting around in whole notes. We could dig into the intricacy of what's happening here at some other point, but if you just skim over this, what you're going to continue to see is that there is one part that's moving, that has all of the movement in it, and the other parts are more stable. They're slower. They're just playing this supporting role. Again, if we're going to talk about textural designs, and we're going to be a little bit more specific than monophony, polyphony, homophony, this is a melody and accompaniment texture that, I mean, or rather, it's a variety of different melody and accompaniment textures that Mahler is creating. And so circling back to your question, John, if you have a clear idea of what these parts are doing, if you have particularly a clear idea of, well, what part is supposed to be in the foreground and what part is supposed to be in the background, in many ways, you can add as many parts as your texture will stand, and it's not going to be a problem. Is that helpful, John?
Yes, yeah, that was helpful. I didn't really think about it in terms of don't be afraid of the kind of the length. Because this is something that I always see with a lot of contemporary works. A lot of people kind of try to jam a lot of stuff in, and they don't really use the space, or they don't use length, like you said. So I kind of have always kind of shied away from allowing there to be breathing room, like Mahler always does. So, and that's helpful to then kind of fill it in with the rest of the voices. So, in
Yeah.
short, yes.
Yeah, good. Oh, I'm glad that this is helpful. Again, in the interest of time, we're going to move on from this, but yeah, no, it's a good question, John. And in some ways, I feel like you were a very wonderful audience plan. So thank you. We're going, again, for the interest of time, I want to get through all these different things that, all these 5 different things. So Greta, if it's all right, if you can hold your question till the end, we will make sure that there's
It's in the
time.
chat. It's in the
Yeah.
chat.
I saw that. Please bring it up at the end.
Okay.
So next thing that I want to show you of, how to write effectively for strings. And this is something that I just really love. So how many of you, just raise of hands, how many of you like baseball? Just curious. So Bernie, Steve, I'm sure that there are others of you that I can't see. Chunming, okay, great. Yeah, so some of us like baseball. So I have a baseball metaphor for you. The cello, if you want to write for the cello well and within a string orchestra context, you need to think about the cello like it's the shortstop. Cello is essentially the shortstop of the string orchestra. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the same way that like the shortstop, either covers over to second base, or sometimes it covers closer to third base. Sometimes it covers all the way out into the outfield. It fulfills all of these various roles. The cello is very similar to that. And, for those of you who are in Sweden and don't know baseball, I apologize for the metaphor, but I think, Henrik, you're sort of getting what I'm after, right? Is that the cello is like this utility player where instead of just fulfilling one role, the cello actually does several different things. So I want to show you some of the different roles that the cello plays, that this piece is a really good example of the cello as kind of the shortstop of the string orchestra. So the very first thing that the cello does, if we go over to the end here, what we'll see is you have the cello acting as the bass. The cello holds down the bass line. In many ways, if you look at how Mozart or Beethoven or Haydn write for the cello, this is how they use the cello. They write the cello as the bass line. And so over here in Mahler, at the very end, this is exactly what he's done here. As he writes the cello, it's holding down the bass line. So that's function number 1 of the cellos. And it's, honestly, it's one of the main functions of the cello. Another function of the cello is it's sometimes called upon to act as an inner voice. So in other words, using the cello as, a tenor part or a baritone part is another thing that the cello gets called on to do from time to time. So for instance, if we go here to measure 25, well, actually, there's a great example of it right here in bar 20, where there's this like interesting little inner voice thing that's happening right here. But all throughout this bit right here, we see that the cello is moving and acting as an inner voice. Here, the bass pizzicato is holding down the bass line, but the cello is, participating in the accompaniment stuff along with the second violin, then the viola. One thing that I just wanted to point out here that was really interesting about this very specific place was this. Who is higher there, the cello or the viola?
Cello.
Yeah, cello's higher.
Cello.
Yeah. You don't have to feel like, I don't know if you ever feel constrained that like these parts have their lanes and they need to stay in their lane and they can never cross over each other. That's just not the case. I mean, if you have a musically convincing reason to cross them over, yeah, totally cross them over, not a problem. I think that Mahler's musically convincing reason to do this is that he's able to create a sense of, by having the cello and the viola cross over and then cross back, this otherwise would have just been, a sustained C4 and a sustained C3. But by not sustaining that, it creates a nicer sense of movement. And kind of like what you just said, Martin, that viola there's a bigger voice from the viola in that register. And so you get that really awesome low cello viola C in that sound that sort of creates that emphasis there. So yeah, great point. Last thing that the cello does, which the example is right here. Cello makes a fantastic soprano. And so here you have actually the cello holding down two roles. You have the cello, the first cellos that are playing the melody, and this melody is of course happening above the violas, right? And then you have the second cellos that are participating actually primarily in they're sort of like tag teaming back and forth about whether they're an inner voice. So here, this D is part of an inner voice, and then we have this in the bass. And then for the rest of this, you have the second cellos and the basses either doubling in unison or an octave holding down the bass line. So in this system, you actually see the cello holding down two different roles. Another thing I think that this system shows very well is you don't need to use the entire string orchestra the entire time. Is that you can just divide parts. If you want to feature the low strings have a really nice sound to them. Likewise, you can do the reverse of this, is if you want to, so Mahler is of course featuring the violas, cellos, and basses. The opposite of this is also a really wonderful sound of just doing the violins and the violas. The overture of the Nutcracker, this is actually what Tchaikovsky does. It's all for violins and violas. There are no cellos and basses. So, if you want to see the opposite, go check that out. It's a really fun piece. And that's how Tchaikovsky was able to make that overture to Nutcracker have that sort of like light, sprightly feeling to it. So, just to recap where we've been so far, we've talked about how Mahler uses the string orchestra texturally. In particular, we talked about how, the strings are not a 5-part choir. We talked about the melody and accompaniment stuff, and we've just finished talking about how the cello is essentially the shortstop of the string section. It has 3 different roles, and if you're not using those 3 different roles, well, you're leaving some options for yourself on the table. So that's the role of the cello. I want to talk now about the role of the double bass, because composers tend to get themselves into problems when they're writing for the double bass. And the biggest way that they get themselves into problems is that they think, oh, the bass has the word bass in it, therefore it is the bass line of the orchestra. This is a recipe for getting yourself into problems. Now, again, if we go back and we look at any Mozart or Haydn symphony, or even many Beethoven symphonies, or even if you move forward to Brahms, what you're going to see is that either entirely or predominantly, the double bass is just simply doubling the cellos an octave below. Now, the reason for this is that it has to do with articulateness. So the basses, of course, add this really nice, low, deep sound, but they're not very articulate. When a cello does something, you know, if a cello does a fast passage, you can sound like, you know, like it has very clean articulation. You can hear the articulation. Whereas if a double bass were to do that, and if you're only doing the double bass, yeah, I see you mouthing that, Christina. It would just sound like moi, 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 moi. It just sounds like a mess. And so cellos and double basses are typically doubled together in octaves in it's sort of like a peanut butter and jelly or a you know, any sort of like team combination thing where you get like the heft of the double basses, but you get the articulateness of the cellos. And then between the two of them, you get this nice full sound that, you know, the cellos otherwise wouldn't have the heft and the double basses wouldn't have the articulateness. And so you combine them together and you get both of those things. Now, there is an exception to this, and Mahler in this movement is exploring this exception all over the place. And so I want to show you like typical
guess
things that the
in my
cello does, and we
Fantasia and
will
fugue, the bass is the fifth
go from
voice of the
there.
fugue. That's the exception.
What was that, Greta?
In my orchestra piece, Fantasia and fugue, the double bass is playing the fifth voice.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I always had to double with another instrument like a bassoon or a tuba.
Yeah, I mean that's what you want to do is if you have the basses there, you're going to want to double them in order to make them a little bit more articulate. So let me show you what Mahler is doing in this symphony and what it is that we can learn from it. So Mahler uses the basses in a variety of ways. And so he's using them like, you know, pretty typical of like doubling the cellos. So if we go over to bars 58 and 59, I mean, this is classic, just this little passage right here. This is the standard of what you're normally going to see the relationship between the basses and cellos, is they're going to be doubling each other in octaves. And that's, you know, typically what it is that you want. Now, something that Mahler does all of the time in this movement that is, you know, another thing that's a very common usage of it is that you find, and if you just back up a couple of bars, you'll see this, is that you have the cellos playing the sustained note and you have the basses doing pizzicato. And here's an example of this where they're doing this in unison. And if we back up, you can find examples of it where this is happening in octaves. So for instance, in bars 5 to 6, you'll see over here, you have the cellos sustaining the note, and then you have the basses pizzing that note an octave below. Now, something that's a little bit unusual that Mahler does as well, I'm just going to mention this in passing, is doubling them at the unison. That's not a very typical usage, but it adds kind of an unusual intensity to things because the higher that you go in the cello range, it has this intensity and sort of like strain to the sound that Mahler is taking advantage of right there. But again, this is more of a special effect than a typical way of usage. So again, doubling the cellos in these different ways, either doubling them in octaves in arco or doubling them like cellos playing arco and then the basses playing pizz, this is pretty typical stuff. A lot of this piece, Mahler is actually writing them independently. And I want to explain to you why is it that Mahler is getting away with this? Why does it sound good, even though, again, I want to rewind to what I said at the start. You typically don't want to treat the bass as the bass voice. Typically, the bass voice is going to be the cellos and basses in combination. That should be like the default in your mind should be the basses and cellos are together acting as the bass. That should be the default. So why is Mahler not doing this default? Why is it that he's getting away with it? Well, there are two ways of getting away with it. Number one has to do with timbre, and number two has to do with tempo. Is that you'll notice that so much of what the basses are doing in this movement are pizzicato. So like, again, this is literally the first note of the thing, pizzicato. And so if we just go through this and skim through it really fast, that's all pizz, that's all pizz, still pizz, and okay, it takes us until rehearsal 1 in order to get our first arco note from the basses, which is this, 3 whole notes that are tied together. And then we have this combination of arco and pizz, and then it's back to pizzicato. More pizzicato, and then long sustained notes, and then back to pizzicato, and then long sustained notes, pizzicato, and then, these are, half notes are kind of like right at the edge of long sustained notes, but then pizz. You're sort of seeing the pattern here, right? Is that if you want to use the double bass independently from the cello as a bass line, you can do that if you do 2 things, and Mahler is showing this to you, is that you can write for the bass independently of the cello if it's playing pizzicato or if it's playing long sustained notes. Because if you're playing long sustained notes in the double bass, then you're not going to run into that articulation issue. If the double bass only needs to go wah, then you're not going to have problems with wah, 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 wah. It's just going wah, 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 and you're getting that fullness of tone that the bass can provide, and you're not really running into the problems with it being inarticulate. So over here in the chat, the bass then acts as a quasi-percussive instrument.
You answered my question. Sorry, I should have just waited. You answered the question already. Sorry.
Okay, cool. Yeah, great.
No,
yeah.
I was just curious, just because I don't know. So at least for me, I don't know about other people, but for cello, I always kind of assume it's like a jazz kind of instrument. And if you listen to cello, like bass jazz, it's just all pizzicato. So that's kind of been the identity I've given it.
Yeah, I think that it's not a bad way of thinking about it, John. Is like quasi-percussive is a way of thinking about it, and like kind of like jazz bass shows. I mean, double bass pizzicato is fairly articulate. I mean, there's a limit to how fast it can be just because of pizzicato. However, you can very clearly hear all of the articulations on double bass pizzicato. So that's the thing. Yeah, and like you said, Steve, harp can do the pizz in a nice way with a different timbre, totally. So 2 more. So we've talked about texture, we've talked about cellos, we've talked about double basses. 2 more things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the upper strings, and we're going to talk about form and focal points. So let's talk about upper strings. There are a couple of things that Mahler does in this movement that I think are like so interesting and characteristic of like, do you want to get the most out of the strings? Do you want it to sound like definitively like, wow, Nicole or Bernie or Henrik, you really know how to write for strings. Mahler has several things that are like that I just want to point out that are here in the upper strings. First thing I want to point out, there's a good example of it over here in, I guess that would be bar, essentially like bars like 39 to 46 or so. You see over here where in the first violin it says D Seite and G Seite. And so D string, G string, right? So what does this mean? So if I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so that I can draw stuff on here. So if I'm a string player, and I am a string player, so I should say as a string player, my open strings are this one, the G string, this one, the D string, this one, the A string, and this one, the E string. So typically, when I'm going to be playing something on my instrument, particularly on these lower strings, the moment that I go above this D right here, I'm going to be playing it on the D string. And the moment that I go above this A, I'm going to be playing whatever this is on the A string. That's just the standard sound of writing for strings. It's easy because it keeps my hand in the same position. I don't have to move my hand up and down the fingerboard. I can just leave my hand right where it is. Makes it very easy to play. If as soon as I go past that D, I'm now on the D string. As soon as I go past this A, I'm now on the A string. that's what's normal, and it gives you in many ways, it gives you the best, for those lower strings, it gives you the best, most characteristic sound. So if I'm saying that this is giving you the best sound, why is Mahler writing for this to be on the D string and on the G string? I mean, many of you probably know this already, is that as you start to go past this, so again, this D should technically, or would commonly be played on the A string. But if I'm going past this, it creates a sense of intensity. The higher I go on the string, the shorter that string gets, and the more intense the sound becomes. And so it makes it sound a little bit strained. It makes it sound a little bit more intense. And so it's a really good effect, is if you want to sound something a little bit, make something sound a little bit more strained, a little bit more intense, a little bit more passionate, then what you can do is you can, mark particular notes, kind of like what Mahler is doing, of just saying, hey, instead of playing this note on the A string, which is what you normally would do, I want you to play this on the D string, because I want that kind of intensity to it. The other thing that this does as well that happens to make this really nice is it makes this grace note really easy, because rather than having to jump over the D string to get to that high D, that D5, I'm only on adjacent strings. Is that this is the G string, this is the D string. I only have to do adjacent strings here. Whereas if I were to play this on the A string, I would have to somehow not touch the D string on my way to the A string to play this. Does that make sense? I have a violin over there. If any of you want me to pull that out, I can pull it out and I can show you. But that's the other thing. So anyway, this is a cool special effect. It works on all string instruments. All string instruments, if you want to, you can tell them which strings do you want these notes to be played on.
I have a quick question. Would you
Yeah,
play
go for it.
from the D all the way to the C in the following measure on that D string?
Well, well, up to here, this would be the assumption.
Right. I mean, not the C, but I mean,
Yeah.
up to the C.
Yeah, the assumption that I mean, if I were reading this, I would assume that, oh, I'm going to play this whole passage until it's obviously I can no longer play this on the D string. Then I'm going to keep this up on the D string. All right, so Martin wants to see the violin. So Martin, you're getting your wish. Let me show you. I'm going to stop my screen just for a moment here. So here's a violin. I'm not making any promises about whether this is in tune because I just literally pulled it out of the case. So if I hold it like this, what you'll see is that that the strings are arched. They're not flat, right? And this is part of what enables you to play play individual notes, because if these strings were flat, if I were to bow over this, then I would be bowing all of the strings. It would be impossible. I could only bow like the fourth string or the first string. I could only do those independently. Otherwise, I'd have to bow all of them at once. And so that arch enables me to play on an individual string at a time. What that also means is that, again, if I'm here on the G string, oh, and wow, that's horribly out of tune. All right, we're calling that close enough. So if I'm here on the G string and I need to go to this D, you see how and you hear, actually, let me turn on my original sound. You see and you hear how if I'm not careful, I have to touch that D string in the middle in order to get to it. The only way that I can not touch the D string is if I very consciously change the direction of the bow and lift it and then move in the other direction. So I can't play that legato. Is that helpful? Great. All right, awesome. I'm glad that's helpful, Martin. Any other questions about this while I have this instrument out? All right, cool. Well, it will be there ready for us in all of its out of tuneness in case we need it again. So, let's wrap up the string writing thing. I want to point out just a couple more string writing things that are, a couple of violin writing things that are just common, and go from there. Okay. So I played violin starting in 4th grade all the way through college. I occasionally bring it out every now and again. And I played a mixture of first and second violin. I don't know if I've ever actually played anything by Mahler, but I've played a lot of string music. And in my experience as a first and second violinist, the same way that the cellos and the basses tend to get doubled in octaves, the first and second violins tend to get doubled in octaves all of the time. Like, this is just such a common thing to have the first and second violins double in octaves. And again, the same way that the basses reinforce, they give that sort of like subwoofer sound to the cellos, having the first violins double an octave above the seconds reinforces those upper partials so that the melody sounds stronger. And so it can be tempting to think, okay, well, who is actually having the melody here? Is it the first or the seconds? Obviously, they both do. But the person who primarily has the melody in a passage like this is actually the second violins. The role of the first violins here is just to reinforce that upper partial. And so when you're writing for strings, I mean, if you do not at some point double your first and second violins, this is just not idiomatic string writing. And, Mahler doubles his first and second violins because he knows how to write idiomatically for strings. I'm not going to belabor that point. I'm just going to, in passing, just mention a couple of places that I thought were really interesting in the viola part. So here in bar 19, there's this really lovely viola solo at rehearsal 1. The sort of like the money string of the viola is that C string. Like, the most characteristic of viola sounds is that lower fifth of the range. It has, really interesting sound. So there at rehearsal 1, take a note of that. Another thing that I thought was really interesting in the viola writing here, again, is just another one of these viola solos. If you were listening to this, sometimes, and I say this because this is a trap that I fell into as I was getting to know the string instruments, is that, I would listen to a recording without a score, and I'd listen to something like this, and I'd think to myself, wow, that's a really great cello solo. And no, it's not. It's the viola. What you're going to find as you're getting to know the string orchestra more and more, so many of the times these things that you think are, quote, great cello solos are actually the violas. And so take a look at the scores, look at them, and just start to notice things like this, of just like, oh, the violas have this fabulous inner voice that composers like Mahler know how to use, and they bring it out to make this great sound. So, last 5 minutes, what I want to talk about is form and focal points. So, I'm going to bring back my diagram over here. This is the form of the piece. The way that I hear it, there are kind of like two big focal points that are happening in this movement, of like the moments where I'm just like, yeah, this is the thing that Mahler really wants us to notice, and like this is sort of like the money moment. The first of those focal points happens. The first of the focal points happens over here at 23, and then you could make an argument for something happening in here, and I think that you'd probably be right, but another significant focal point is happening at measures 91 to the end, is in some ways he finishes the movement at like this really great moment of intensity, and I just wanted to point out some things that Mahler is doing at both of these places, that the way that he's writing for strings to really make these passages stand out. So let's pull those up. If we go to if we go to here, right here in 30, so this is the passage that I was telling you about where it's like, yeah, we're going to come back to this. And now we're coming back to it. So, just for reference, well, actually, in the sake of time, I'm not going to do it. So we have this falling scale that goes to this bran da 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 ba da da ba da. It's that part. Let me just take this apart and we'll talk about what's happening here. So he has the first and second violins playing in unison. He continues that unison down into the violas and the cellos. So essentially it's just this unison line that is happening, and it goes down here so that we can get those lower notes. The real problem note would have been this G flat right here. He could have continued everything, he could have continued everything except for that G flat in the second violins, and you'll note that it's missing there in the first violins. So in order to maintain the continuity of line, at this point in bar 30, he transitions over to the violas and the cellos. The other reason that's nice about doing that is that you're going to get a more fuller, intense sound from the violas and the cellos here. This is right smack in the sweet spot of the violas range, and then this is like smack in like the tenor sweet spot of the cello. And so you're getting this really wonderful, this naturally not only intense, but also just a very comfortable intensity sound by putting it here. So that's what's happening here. You have these arpeggios. This, I think, is just really interesting about how it is that he orchestrates these arpeggios. You'll note that you have violin 1 and 2 in unison right here. And then the violin 2 arpeggios down, and then brings us to that F. You have the viola that is sitting around on this C. So this is the note that the viola is on. The viola is right there up until this arpeggio. And so by dividing the cellos and by judiciously using the second violins, he's able to get downward arpeggio, downward arpeggio, downward arpeggio, downward arpeggio that is contrasting to the upward arpeggios in the harp. This passage would not be possible if Mahler didn't divide his strings. It just wouldn't work. Another little detail that I'll point out is that you'll notice that the double basses start out on this high C and then gets doubled. They meet up with the second cellos over here. And again, the reason that Mahler does this is because Mahler's like, I want to have this firm foundation here, and I don't want to wait until this beat in order to have that firm foundation. And so we have these octave Cs here in the bass. The cello meets up with the double bass. This goes down there, and then, well, you see the rest. So, yeah, kind of like what you're saying, John, the contrary motion is really fascinating. So this is this passage, and just a couple of things I think are really interesting about what makes this, what helps make this passage a focal point. Obviously, there's a whole other thing that we could talk about as well about harmonically. Coming to this 1-6-4 chord here is a really strong harmonic arrival point. And if we go to the end, we're going to see that there's some other very similar, interesting things that are happening in this final system. You have here the first and second violins that are in octaves. I'm just going to sort of take this layer by layer and explain what it is that we're looking at. We have the first and second violins in octaves. These triplets stand in distinction to those 16th notes right here. It really helps draw attention to that rising second violin line. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-bra. And then we have, again, more of that contrary motion between the cellos and the second violins. Another thing that I'll point out as well is so that we have, here we have A6, here is A5, here is A4 in the cellos. This is another thing that you'll tend to see a lot in string writing as well, is that you'll is that oftentimes the cellos or violas will add a third octave to what's happening in the texture. And so all of this stuff in the violas is actually underneath the cellos, right up until somewhere around here. So the cellos and the second violins moving in opposition with each other. I already mentioned this unison right here and about the interesting thing about that. And then here, in some ways, the interesting thing about here is like how it is that he augments the rhythm, and it goes from there. But the main thing that I wanted to point out is just the interesting doublings that are going on here. You have the first, seconds, and cellos that are in 3 octaves. You have the violas that are holding down the harmonic fort in that tenor range. And then you have this contrary motion thing that's happening here along with the basses and cellos in unison. That's this really interesting special effect. So we are now out of time. Just to sort of recap again, the 5 things that I wanted to point out that Mahler teaches us about string writing. Thing number 1, use of textures. Mahler is not writing for the string orchestra like it's a 5-part choir. Mahler is using divisi all over the place in order to create richer, more interesting sounds. In addition to doing that, Mahler is also, at times dropping out parts, leaving parts out of the texture just to get the sound that he wants, to make it fuller or to make it thinner. Another thing that, again, that is making sure that Mahler is not writing it like, this is a part writing exercise, is that Mahler's writing this using a melody and accompaniment texture. There's a clear distinction between the rhythms of the accompaniment and the rhythm of the melody. So that's thing number 1, all of that textural stuff. Thing number 2, cello is the shortstop of the orchestra. It acts as bass, it acts as inner voice, it acts as soprano, and you're going to find that the cello is hopping around doing that all over the place, and sometimes, kind of like what we saw in this passage right here, it's actually fulfilling 2 of those roles at the very same time. Thing number 3, we talked about the role of the double bass, which is typically to double the cellos, and then we talked about if it's not doubling the cellos and actually being the bass, how can you get away with the double basses acting like a true bass without sounding like garbage? This piece is a fantastic example of how you can do that. We talked about some of the different effects that you can have in the upper strings, about using the G and the D strings on the violins, about writing for the violin 1 and 2 in octaves, and about with the violas. And then we examined really briefly some of these interesting focal points and how it is that Mahler wrote for the string section there. So those are the 5 points that I wanted to share with you about Mahler's string writing. Thank you all for joining me. I think we'll stick around here for about 10 minutes of questions if anyone has any questions, and we'll go from there. So anyway, thank you all for being here and for your participation.
Joseph, I have a question about the score we're looking at. That would be considered the conductor's score, I guess, and the parts would be individual lines. Would that be correct? So that, the first violins, when they're divisi, one part would have only one line, the other line, or would they be combined in one staff?
Yeah, great question. So the strings do this a little bit differently than the woodwinds do. On woodwinds, whenever you have one line of music is always and forever one part in the woodwinds. However, for the strings, let me find that cello thing again, because this is a good example. So over here in the cellos, if you look at the cello part, the cello, you will see 2 staves on the cello part. You'll see both of these staves on the cello part, and once it comes back together, it will combine into one stave, into one staff. So if we scroll down a little bit further, if we were to look at the cello part, once it gets down to here, they would only see one staff. And so if you're having complex divisi like that in a string part, you'll see that it's going to go back and forth between one staff and 2 or more staves. Now, if the divisi is relatively simple, kind of like what you have in the violas, the viola part is going to look like this, is that they'll have multiple of those parts just written on one staff. So,
or the individual players.
Yeah, that every violist is going to see every viola player is going to have the exact same part, and all of those viola parts are going to have this on one line.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
So
good question.
I have a question about divisi.
Yeah, go ahead. Who's asking this, by the way?
It's Bernie.
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 Go ahead. Yeah.
Long-standing question. So, whenever we see divisi, like not two, like more than two,
Yeah.
the question we always have is, how do you want it divided up?
Mhm.
And sometimes we do it by stand, and sometimes we do it by player, inside, outside.
Mhm.
But I never see it specified in the parts.
Yeah.
Composers never seem to specify how they want to divide it up. How important do you think that is?
Well,
That's why I made the comment about like if I was going to write a six voice fugue for an orchestra and you have the strange, could I divide the violas into two sections or maybe a violin section into other two sections or
yeah.
Well, I'm talking like in the
We'll
standard.
get to that in a moment, Greta. Thank you. So Bernie, to your question, the fact that you're not seeing it in scores should give you an indication of how important it is.
Okay.
That is the kind of thing that typically the conductor, the concertmaster is going to figure out. Now, if you do have something very specific in mind, if you look in the right score, if you look at enough scores, you will find that composers actually do sometimes give those indications. But generally speaking, for like 90% of the time, it's just not important to them. Just tell them, divisi or div entre, divide into four, and then just let them figure it out.
Okay. And I just wanted to point out that this is a really hard piece to play because of the long lines, and it's so tender, it falls apart very easily. So as an orchestra, it's really hard.
Yeah, no, I believe it. Cool. Any other questions?
I might have one. Is Mahler's orchestration of the strings considered as as the best that we can find? I don't know. Is it the referral, compared to any classical composers on strings? Would you take Mahler as number one?
No, I probably wouldn't. I would put, in part just because I wouldn't rank composers like that. But I would say that, in terms of but I might put them into different tiers of just like, this is top tier orchestra writing, this is like second tier string writing. I would put Mahler in the top tier, but I would also probably put Debussy in the top tier. I'd put Brahms. Brahms totally belongs in that top tier of string writing. Dvorak as well. There are a lot of really excellent string writers out there. But this is a good example of quality string writing.
Thank you.
Joseph, I had a question.
Go ahead.
Measures, the first part of the A and the B and the coming back to the A all use that same harp motif.
Mhm.
And I haven't seen that before where you've got something leading in and then it leads into one thing and it leads into another. Is there anything to learn from that? Like you have this same harp motif and then suddenly it breaks off into the B section.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. It's a detail of this piece that I actually really love. Let me see if I can't find where my formal diagram goes, because I have something I want to say in relation to that. Okay, cool. So what I think is really, for me, the thing that I think is really interesting about this is when we hear it here first, we hear it as the start of the piece, right? And it has a very introductory sort of quality, right? For me, the thing I love about it when it happens right here is that, and we could dig into the details of why, it sounds conclusive right there. Is when I hear it there at bars 37 to 38, it sounds like, okay, we're bringing this, we're landing this airplane. And so there's sort of like a formal ambiguity to the way that Mahler uses that passage that I think is just really beautiful. And for me, that's the thing. For me, that's the thing that I think is really worth learning about this is that when you repeat things, so like, these are the three places that it's repeated, right? When you repeat things, you have an opportunity to mess with the listener's expectations of what does this thing mean. And for me, I think that this piece is an example of this. Does that help, Steve?
Yeah, that's great. So it's kind of almost like a deceptive cadence in its purpose at that point.
Yeah. Well, and we could talk about it in expressive terms as well. I think the thing that's so magical about the opening is it feels like it's holding its breath, right? Where, we're just sort of like oscillating on two pitches or two pitch classes just between C's and A's. And there's just this like, it's not unsettled in the sense that it's unnerving, but it's just not grounded in anything yet. So again, I think I'm using the metaphor holding its breath. That's what it reminds me of. And I don't remember where I was going with that, but somehow that relates back to this idea of how it is that Mahler is using this formally and what the expressive intent of it is. Might relate to the story that the symphony was written for. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Joe. Yeah, totally. Anyone else? We have time for one or two more questions.
Are we going to get to mine?
Yeah, absolutely. Greta, go ahead. What's your question?
That's what I said earlier. Did you forget?
Well, I'll have to scroll back through the chat in order to find it. Give me a moment. I think I found it.
I mean, if I was going to write a 6-voice fugue for orchestra, like, if I divide the strings, like, would it be best to divide the violas into two sections? Or could I divide a violin one or two sections to another section so I could, like, have 3 sections of violins, or divide those into 2 sections?
Yeah, great question.
Like, how do you make that kind of decision if you're going to divide a string section like that?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you for asking it, Greta. I think it's like right to the point of what we were talking about today. The short answer that I would say is what I would probably do, right? If I were dividing it, is I would probably look at dividing either the first or second violins or the violas or cellos. I would not divide the double basses. And what I might do here, it'd probably be easier to draw this out. Sometimes, like, picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So if I had a 6-voice fugue,
yeah,
here is violin 1, here is violin 2, here is viola, here is cello, here is bass. So what I might do is I might do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you'll note that there's nothing in the bass. But there are a lot of potential ways to divide this up. And so what I'd encourage you to do, Greta, is not to think that, 6 voices, once I've made these divisions, they are always and forever going to be divided like this. Is that you can actually change up who is playing what parts depending on what it is that you want. So for instance, you could have a part of your 6-voice fugue where you're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You see? So divide violin 1 into 2 parts, divide violin 2 into 2 parts, divide the viola into 2 parts, right? You could actually do a similar sort of thing with the low strings. You could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it'd be sort of weird. It'd be kind of messy down there to have the cellos to have the basses divided. But if you wrote the basses high enough, you could probably get away with it. Another thing that you could consider doing that could potentially work is you could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all in just violins 1 and 2. So you see how there's. I could go out continuing to lay out different options.
Yeah.
For you, but you see how you can divide these things in any different way that you want, and it's just going to give you a different sound. We're going to call this option number 1. Option number one is going to give you a full sound that spans all the different registers, or at least if you use it the way that you know, if you use it the way that you would just assume to use it, that would give you all the different registers. Options number 2 and 4 would give you sort of higher registers. Option number 3 would give you lower registers. There is actually, so we can call this 1A, we can call this 1B, where if we say put violin 1 into the, we'll put them into the 6th octave, we'll put violin 2 into the 5th octave, we'll keep, and then maybe we'll keep these in the 4th, and then we'll put this in the 3rd, is that there would be ways of dividing it such that, you know, even though we're using the cellos, we could use the cellos such that they never go below F3, for instance, and still have 2 parts in the cellos. The cellos have a lot of range to deal with. Likewise, that goes up there. Yeah, so you'll note in the chat as well, Greta, Bernie mentions the Villalobos cello octet. That, again, is another option, is that if you wanted to divide the cellos into 6 parts and have your 6-part fugue just in the cellos, you could do that as well. So, anyway, does that help answer your question, Greta?
Yeah.
Great. I think it's I think it's really fun, the idea of writing a 6-part fugue for strings, and the great thing about writing for strings is you can take it in a lot of directions. One last thing that I'll say on that point, Greta, is have a look at Bartók's music for strings, percussion, and celeste. You're going to see a lot of fugue-like writing in that piece, and you'll see all of the ways that Bartók divides his strings when he's writing for many, many different parts. Cool. So I'm seeing, you know, some chatter that's happening here. Do we know any background on why Mahler chose just strings and harp for this movement? I don't know anything else. As I'm skimming over the chat, I don't know anything else that any of you are saying for this, so couldn't tell you. So I'm going to say there's time for one last question. Any last thoughts or questions that people have? What is another example of string writing that I'd recommend to analyze that's not a slow movement? Yeah, let me show you. Let me show you perhaps one of my favorite examples of string writing. And actually, I'm gonna give you two things. I'll show you first. This is my favorite example of string writing, and then I'll find something that maybe that's a little bit more contemporary. If you have never analyzed Dvorak's Serenade for Strings, you must analyze this piece. Dvorak makes the string orchestra sound like $1 million. Like it's like the string orchestra sounds fabulous in the way that Dvorak writes it. There are 5 different movements in this piece from a whole variety and range of tempos. Let me just play you just the first bit of the finale, just because I love it. Yeah, anyway, it goes on from there. But yeah, I would totally say Serenade for Strings. It's just such a great example of how to write for strings. And then let me give you something a little bit more contemporary, just to give you a different perspective on things. You know what I might say? I'd say either the Ludoslavsky Concerto for Orchestra or the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra. And I'm going to say the Ludoslavsky just because everyone knows Bartók. They don't necessarily know Ludoslavsky. But Ludoslavsky is a fabulous orchestrator. He's one of the best orchestrators of the 20th century. So if you go through and you look at how Ludoslavsky uses the strings, Concerto for Orchestra is a great piece. Mi Parti. So the nice thing about this one is obviously the score is here. You'll find some really great string writing in Mi Parti, but you might have to, work a little bit to dig out a score for that. But yeah, so I'll say something by that. Joe is recommending Chris Rouse's Infernal Machine. Yeah, Chris Rouse is another really great one. And actually, let me give you one more while I'm thinking. Joe, you reminded me of. Let me show you. Let me show you one of my favorite pieces that I found recently. That was just such an incredible piece of music, but also features really great string writing. Son et Lumière by Stephen Stuckey. This is just a fantastic piece of orchestration. I mean, the orchestration, this is absolutely outstanding, but you're also going to find some incredible string writing in this piece as well. So, Son et Lumière by Stephen Stuckey. So, cool. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to hang out with all of you. Martin asks, is there any chance of another event like this? Please let us know. Yeah, so if you're on my mailing list, you will find out about this. Also, if you're on my mailing list, you will get the replay to this. If you haven't yet signed up for this, let me just put this link really fast in the chat and I'll talk a bit. If you didn't sign up through this link, this will get you onto my mailing list. This will get you access to the replay of this event, and you'll also get announcements for all future events that I'll be having like this. I'm going to be continue to have score study and analysis events like this throughout the year. If you have any particular scores that you want to look at, this Mahler 5 actually came from a recommendation from someone the last time that we did something last month. Last month we looked at, I think, La Mer, and so this month we looked at Mahler, and that was somebody's recommendation. So if you have a recommendation, if you have something that you want us to look at, send it my way, and as you saw, we might end up looking at it. So anyway, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to seeing you all next month or whenever I have the next one of these. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Just send me an email, and we'll chat. Anyway, take care, everybody. I will see you all later.
Thanks a lot.